Why Viking women's lives were brutal. The disturbing way Vikings treated their wives. Before we begin, tell me something about where you are. Is it night or day where you're watching this? The morning mist clung to the fjord like a shroud as 15-year-old Astrid stirred on her straw mattress in the dimly lit longhouse. The year was 847 CE, and the settlement of Birka hummed with the quiet activity of dawn. As the daughter of a successful trader, Astrid had enjoyed relative comfort in her childhood, but now, on the cusp of womanhood, the harsh realities of Viking society were beginning to reveal themselves in ways that would fundamentally alter her understanding of her place in the world. The longhouse stretched nearly 60 feet in length, its timber walls weathered by countless winters. Smoke from the central hearth drifted lazily toward the roof opening, carrying with it the scent of last night's mutton stew and the ever-present dampness that seemed to permeate every corner of their wooden world. Astrid's mother, Sigrid, was already awake, her calloused hands working methodically to prepare the morning meal. At 32, Sigrid bore the weathered appearance of a woman who had survived 4 pregnancies and countless harsh winters, her once golden hair now streaked with premature gray. The social structure of Viking society was rigid and unforgiving, particularly for women. From birth, a girl's value was measured primarily by her potential as a wife and mother, her ability to produce strong sons who could raid and trade, and daughters who could forge strategic alliances through marriage. Education, as we understand it today, was non-existent for most women. Instead, they learned through observation and practice the essential skills of running a household, preserving food, weaving cloth, and managing the complex social dynamics that kept their communities functioning during the long months when the men were away on raids or trading expeditions. Astrid's father, Ragnar, was a successful merchant who traded amber and furs along the rivers of Eastern Europe. His frequent absences meant that Sigrid effectively ran the household, making decisions about everything from food distribution to settling disputes among the servants and thralls. Yet despite this practical authority, Sigrid had no legal standing in the broader community. She could not own property in her own name, could not represent herself in legal matters, and had no say in major decisions affecting the family's future. The morning routine began before dawn and continued relentlessly until well past sunset. Astrid watched her mother move through the familiar motions, checking the grain stores, inspecting the dried fish hanging from the rafters, and ensuring that the thralls were properly attending to their duties. The thralls, captured during raids or born into bondage, represented the lowest rung of Viking society. But even they served as a reminder to free women of how precarious their own position truly was. As the pale northern sun struggled to penetrate the morning clouds, Astrid began to understand that her childhood was ending. Soon, negotiations would begin for her marriage, and her father would weigh offers from potential suitors based on political advantage and economic gain. Her own desires, her fears, her dreams for the future, these were considerations that would play little role in determining her fate. The brutal reality of Viking society was about to reshape every aspect of her existence, and there would be no escape from the path that had been chosen for her before she was even born. 3 weeks had passed since the autumn equinox, and the trading season was drawing to a close. The great market at Birka bustled with activity as merchants from across Scandinavia gathered to conduct their final business before the harsh winter months set in. It was here, among the stalls selling everything from Byzantine silk to Frankish weapons, that Astrid first witnessed the casual brutality with which women were treated as commodities in Viking society. The practice of bride price negotiations was conducted with the same methodical precision that Vikings applied to their trading ventures. Astrid watched from a distance as her father engaged in heated discussions with Olaf the Red, a wealthy landowner from the western settlements. The conversation centered not on Astrid's character or her potential happiness, but on the practical value she would bring to a marriage alliance. Her weaving skills, her knowledge of herbcraft, her potential fertility, all were evaluated and assigned monetary worth like livestock at market. The legal framework surrounding Viking marriage was complex and heavily weighted in favor of men. A woman's consent was technically required for marriage, but this consent was often coerced through family pressure, economic necessity, or outright threats. The morning gift, traditionally given by the groom to the bride on the morning after the wedding night, was ostensibly meant to provide for her security, but in practice it rarely amounted to enough to ensure true independence. Most women remained economically dependent on their husbands throughout their lives, with no real recourse if they found themselves in abusive situations. Astrid's education in the harsh realities of marriage began with observing the women around her. Her neighbor, Helga, bore the faded bruises of her husband's displeasure. Yet she moved through her daily routines with the resigned acceptance of someone who had learned that resistance only brought more pain. The marks on Helga's arms were hidden beneath her long sleeves, but the careful way she moved, the way she flinched when her husband Bjorn raised his voice, told a story that was repeated throughout the settlement. The concept of divorce existed in Viking society, but it was a double-edged sword for women. While a woman could theoretically seek divorce for specific reasons, such as her husband's persistent absence, his failure to provide for her, or his habitual violence, the social and economic consequences were severe. A divorced woman lost her home, her social standing, and often her children. She would be forced to return to her father's household, where she would be viewed as a burden and a source of shame. For many women, this fate seemed worse than enduring an unhappy marriage. As the negotiations for Astrid's marriage continued, she began to understand the intricate web of obligations and expectations that would govern her future life. She would be expected to manage her husband's household with efficiency and grace, to bear children regularly and without complaint, and to maintain the family's reputation through her conduct. Any failure in these duties would be met with consequences that ranged from social ostracism to physical punishment. The romantic notions of love and partnership that young girls might harbor were luxuries that Viking society could not afford. The weight of these realizations settled over Astrid like the approaching winter darkness. Her fate was being decided in conversations from which she was excluded, by men who viewed her as a means to an end rather than a person with her own dreams and aspirations. The brutal truth was becoming clear. In Viking society, a woman's value was measured solely by her utility to men, and her survival depended on her ability to fulfill expectations that she had no role in creating. The wedding preparations began with the onset of winter's first snowfall, transforming the settlement into a world of pristine white that seemed to mock the darkness of Astrid's situation. The ceremony itself would be a grand affair, befitting the alliance between two prosperous families. But beneath the celebration lay traditions that revealed the deeply ingrained attitudes toward women in Viking society. The wedding was scheduled for the winter solstice, when the longest night of the year would symbolically give way to the return of light, an irony that was not lost on Astrid as she contemplated her future. The pre-wedding rituals began with the ceremonial bath, a tradition that was both practical and symbolic. Astrid was taken to the women's bathhouse, where the married women of the community gathered to prepare her for her new role. The ritual cleansing was meant to purify her for marriage, but it also served as an opportunity for the older women to share the harsh realities of married life. Their words, spoken in hushed tones amid the steam and smoke, painted a picture of submission and endurance that chilled Astrid more than the winter air outside. Thorhild, the settlement's eldest matron, spoke with the authority of someone who had survived 40 years of marriage. Her words carried the weight of experience. A wise woman learns to bend like the willow in the storm. Those who stand rigid like the oak are the ones who break. The metaphor was clear, and its implications were chilling. Resistance would be met with force, and survival depended on a woman's ability to adapt to circumstances beyond her control. The wedding feast itself was a lavish display of the groom's wealth and status. Olaf the Red had spared no expense, providing enough mead and ale to keep the entire settlement drunk for 3 days. The great hall was decorated with tapestries depicting scenes of battle and conquest, a reminder of the violent world that shaped Viking society. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meat, fresh bread, and imported delicacies that spoke to the prosperity of the match. During the ceremony, Astrid was required to exchange her maiden's circlet for the bound hair of a married woman, a symbolic transformation that marked her transition from her father's property to her husband's. The ritual sword exchange, where the groom presented his bride with a family sword to pass on to their future sons, reinforced the notion that women existed primarily to perpetuate the male line. Even the wedding vows, spoken before the assembled community, emphasized duty and obedience rather than love and partnership. The wedding night brought its own set of brutal realities. The tradition of the bed blessing, where the couple was escorted to their marriage bed by the wedding party, was designed to ensure that the marriage was properly consummated. There was no privacy, no gentle introduction to intimacy, and no consideration for the bride's feelings or fears. The marriage bed was a public spectacle, with witnesses waiting outside to confirm that the union had been completed according to custom. As the celebration continued into the early hours of the morning, Astrid lay in her new husband's bed, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling and listening to the sounds of revelry from the great hall. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. She was now completely dependent on a man she barely knew, in a society that offered her no protection if he chose to abuse that power. The brutal truth was that her wedding night had been less about beginning a new life and more about confirming her status as property that had changed hands. The first months of Astrid's marriage revealed the complex and often contradictory nature of women's roles in Viking society. While legally she was under her husband's authority, the practical demands of managing a large household gave her a form of power that was both significant and severely limited. Olaf's farmstead was one of the largest in the region, employing dozens of thralls and free servants, and the responsibility for overseeing their daily activities fell squarely on Astrid's shoulders. The winter of 847 was particularly harsh, with temperatures dropping so low that the fjord froze solid for the first time in living memory. The extreme cold made every aspect of household management a matter of life and death. Astrid found herself responsible for rationing food supplies, managing the health of both humans and livestock, and maintaining the complex social hierarchy that kept the estate functioning. The thralls, mostly captured during raids on Irish monasteries, looked to her for guidance while simultaneously resenting her authority. The morning routine began before dawn with the lighting of fires and the preparation of the day's first meal. Astrid learned to calculate precisely how much grain could be used each day to ensure that supplies would last until spring, a mathematical exercise that required her to balance the immediate needs of 43 people against the uncertainty of when the next supply shipment would arrive. The consequences of miscalculation were severe. Starvation was a real possibility if the food stores were exhausted before the spring trading season began. Managing the thralls required a different set of skills entirely. These captured slaves, mostly Irish monks and Celtic villagers, had been torn from their homes and forced into bondage. Their resentment was palpable, and their potential for rebellion was a constant concern. Astrid learned to identify the signs of trouble. The way conversations stopped when she entered a room, the subtle defiance in their body language, the whispered conversations in languages she didn't understand. The threat of violence was always present, and she was expected to maintain order through a combination of authority and fear. The textile work that occupied much of the winter months revealed another aspect of women's economic importance in Viking society. Astrid supervised the production of wool cloth, linen, and the intricate tapestries that were both functional and symbolic. The quality of these textiles reflected directly on the family's status, and they served as a form of portable wealth that could be traded or given as gifts. The work was grueling, requiring long hours of sitting in poorly lit conditions, and the constant repetitive motions often led to permanent damage to the hands and wrists. The legal authority that came with managing the household was limited by the reality that ultimate power remained with her husband. While Astrid could make day-to-day decisions about food distribution, work assignments, and minor disputes, any major issues had to be referred to Olaf. This created a frustrating dynamic where she bore the responsibility for problems, but lacked the authority to implement comprehensive solutions. When one of the thralls was caught stealing food, for example, she could impose minor punishments, but the decision about whether to sell the offender or inflict more severe punishment belonged to her husband. The isolation of the winter months also revealed the emotional toll of her new life. Cut off from her family and childhood friends, Astrid found herself surrounded by people who viewed her primarily as an extension of her husband's authority, rather than as an individual. The loneliness was profound, and it was compounded by the realization that this would be her life for the foreseeable future. There would be no escape from the endless cycle of domestic duties, no opportunity for personal growth or self-expression beyond the narrow confines of her role as a wife and household manager. Spring arrived late in 848, bringing with it the first confirmation of Astrid's pregnancy. The news was greeted with celebration throughout the settlement. But for Astrid, it marked the beginning of a new and terrifying chapter in her understanding of women's lives in Viking society. Pregnancy in the 9th century was a dangerous gamble with death, and the medical knowledge available to help women through childbirth was primitive at best. The settlement's healer, an elderly woman named Ragnhild, had delivered hundreds of babies over her 40-year career, but she was also intimately familiar with the many ways that childbirth could go wrong. The maternal mortality rate was staggering. Nearly 1 in 4 women died in childbirth or from complications in the weeks following delivery. These statistics were not abstract numbers. They were represented by empty spaces in the longhouses, by children raised by stepmothers, and by the haunted expressions of women who had watched their friends and sisters die in agony. The physical demands of pregnancy were compounded by the expectation that women would continue their normal duties until the moment of delivery. Astrid found herself managing the household, supervising the spring planting, and organizing the complex logistics of the trading season while dealing with the nausea, fatigue, and physical discomfort of her condition. There was no concept of modified duties or special care for pregnant women. They were expected to maintain their full range of responsibilities until they were physically unable to continue. The summer months brought a new set of challenges as Astrid's pregnancy progressed. The heat made the physical discomfort worse, and the constant activity of the trading season meant that she was on her feet for 12 to 14 hours each day. The lack of understanding about proper nutrition during pregnancy meant that she continued to eat the same sparse diet as everyone else, with no special provisions for her condition. The folk wisdom of the time included numerous superstitions about pregnancy, but little practical knowledge about the physical and nutritional needs of expectant mothers. The social dynamics surrounding pregnancy revealed another layer of the complex relationship between women and power in Viking society. While Astrid's condition theoretically elevated her status, she was fulfilling her primary biological function. It also made her more vulnerable. A woman who failed to produce healthy male heirs could find herself divorced and cast out, regardless of the circumstances that led to the failure. The pressure to not only survive childbirth but to deliver the right kind of child created a constant state of anxiety that affected every aspect of her life. The approach of winter brought increasing concern about the timing of the birth. Babies born during the harsh winter months had a much lower survival rate, and the limited availability of fresh food meant that nursing mothers often struggled to produce adequate milk. Ragnhild shared stories of winters when multiple infants had died, not from any specific illness, but from the general hardship of trying to survive in a world that offered little margin for error. The preparations for childbirth were elaborate, but often counterproductive. The birthing chamber was sealed off from the rest of the house to prevent evil spirits from entering. But this also meant that the air became stale, and the risk of infection increased. The traditional birthing position, squatting or kneeling, was more physiologically sound than lying flat. But the lack of understanding about cleanliness and infection control meant that many women died from complications that would have been easily preventable with proper medical knowledge. As Astrid entered her final month of pregnancy, she began to understand that survival was not guaranteed. The stories shared by the women around her painted a picture of childbirth as a battle that many women lost. The brutal reality was that her value to her husband and to society was tied to her ability to produce healthy children. But the process of doing so might well cost her life. The approaching birth represented both the fulfillment of her biological destiny and a potentially fatal test of her body's ability to withstand the demands placed upon it. The first labor pains struck Astrid during the darkest hour of the winter solstice, as if the longest night of the year had chosen to test her resolve when her strength was at its lowest ebb. The timing was both symbolic and terrifying. In Viking culture, children born during the solstice were thought to be blessed by the gods, but the harsh reality was that winter births carried the highest mortality rates for both mother and child. Ragnhild arrived at the farmstead as the first blizzard of the season began to howl across the fjord. The old healer carried with her a collection of herbs, iron tools, and the accumulated wisdom of decades spent attending births, but even she could not mask the concern in her weathered face. At 63, she had seen too many young women die in childbirth to offer false comfort. Her presence was both reassuring and ominous, a reminder that while she had delivered hundreds of healthy babies, she had also presided over far too many deaths. The birthing chamber was prepared according to ancient traditions that blended practical necessity with superstition. Iron objects were placed around the room to ward off evil spirits, but these same tools would serve practical purposes if surgical intervention became necessary. The birthing chair, carved from oak and passed down through generations of women, was positioned to take advantage of gravity while providing support for the exhausting process ahead. Candles and oil lamps provided flickering light, but they also contributed to the stifling atmosphere that made breathing difficult. The social dynamics of childbirth revealed the complex relationships between women in Viking society. While men were strictly excluded from the birthing chamber, women from across the settlement gathered to provide support, share their experiences, and witness the continuation of the community's bloodline. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They provided practical assistance, but they also reinforced the bonds between women who shared common experiences and fears. The stories they told during the long hours of labor were meant to distract and encourage, but they also served as a form of collective memory, passing down knowledge about the dangers and mysteries of childbirth. The labor itself was a brutal test of endurance that lasted nearly 2 days. Astrid's screams echoed through the longhouse, a sound that had become as familiar as the winter wind to the women of the settlement. The pain was beyond anything she had imagined, and it was compounded by the knowledge that her survival was far from guaranteed. Ragnhild monitored the progress with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether a birth was proceeding normally or spiraling toward tragedy. The moment of delivery brought both relief and terror. The baby, a healthy son, emerged into the world with a cry that seemed to cut through the winter darkness. But the ordeal was far from over. The afterbirth had to be delivered, the bleeding had to be controlled, and the critical first hours of the infant's life had to be navigated successfully. In Viking society, a newborn was not considered truly alive until it had survived its first night, and many infants who appeared healthy at birth succumbed to unknown causes within hours. The aftermath of childbirth revealed the harsh realities of postpartum care in the 9th century. There was no understanding of the need for rest and recovery. Women were expected to resume their normal duties within days of giving birth. The risk of infection was high, and the lack of knowledge about proper hygiene meant that many women who survived the birth itself died from complications in the weeks that followed. Astrid's survival of both the birth and the critical recovery period was a victory, but it was also a reminder of how precarious life was for women in Viking society. The successful delivery of a healthy son elevated Astrid's status within the household and the broader community, but it also marked the beginning of a new set of challenges. She was now responsible not only for managing the household, but also for raising the next generation of Vikings. The brutal reality was that her value as a woman was now tied to her ability to keep her son alive and healthy, to bear additional children, and to maintain the complex web of relationships that kept the family's social and economic position secure. The birth had been a test of her physical endurance, but the real challenge was just beginning. The harsh winter of 849 brought news that would fundamentally alter the social fabric of the settlement. 3 longships had been lost in a storm off the coast of Frisia, taking with them nearly 40 men, including several prominent landowners and traders. The immediate consequence was the creation of a new class of women, the war widows, whose husbands had died not in glorious battle but in the cold embrace of the North Sea. These women found themselves in a precarious position that illuminated the brutal realities of how Viking society treated women who could no longer fulfill their primary function as extensions of male authority. Astrid watched from her position as a new mother as the settlement's social hierarchy shifted to accommodate this sudden influx of women without male protection. The legal status of widows in Viking society was complex and often contradictory. While they theoretically enjoyed more independence than married women, this freedom came at a terrible cost. A widow could own property, conduct business, and make legal decisions, but she was also vulnerable to exploitation. violence, and social ostracism in ways that married women were not. The most tragic case was that of Ingrid, who had been widowed at 23 with 3 young children. Her husband's death meant that she inherited his debts as well as his property, and the vultures began circling almost immediately. Creditors who had been patient with her husband's repayment schedule suddenly demanded immediate settlement, knowing that a woman alone had few options for generating the kind of income necessary to satisfy their claims. The legal system that theoretically protected widows' rights was administered by men who had their own interest to consider, and justice was often a luxury that only the wealthy could afford. The economic challenges facing widows were compounded by the physical demands of managing property and livestock without male assistance. Ingrid's farm required constant attention, from the daily milking of cows to the seasonal planting and harvesting of crops. The work was backbreaking even for a strong man with help, and for a woman managing alone while caring for small children, it was nearly impossible. The community provided some assistance, but this help came with strings attached, expectations of gratitude, deference, and eventual repayment that could create new forms of bondage. The social isolation experienced by widows was perhaps even more devastating than the economic hardship. In a society where a woman's identity was largely defined by her relationship to men, the loss of a husband meant the loss of social standing and community connection. Former friends became distant, partly out of superstition, the belief that widowhood was somehow contagious, and partly out of practical concerns about being associated with women who had fallen from grace. The loneliness was profound and all-consuming, creating a form of psychological torture that many widows found harder to bear than physical hardship. The pressure to remarry was constant and overwhelming. Well-meaning neighbors, family members, and community leaders all offered advice about the necessity of finding a new husband as quickly as possible. The message was clear: a woman alone was an aberration, a disruption of the natural order that needed to be corrected. But remarriage for a widow was fraught with complications. Any property she brought to a new marriage would become her new husband's property, and her children from her first marriage would be at the mercy of a stepfather who had no blood obligation to provide for them. The winter deepened, and with it came the realization that some of the newly created widows would not survive until spring. The combination of economic pressure, social isolation, and the physical demands of managing property alone proved too much for women who had never been prepared for such challenges. 2 widows in the settlement succumbed to what the community euphemistically called winter sickness, but what was really a combination of malnutrition, exhaustion, and despair. Their death served as a grim reminder to all women of how precarious their position truly was, and how quickly they could find themselves cast out from the protection of the social order they had always known. The spring of 850 brought disturbing news from the eastern settlements that would reshape Astrid's understanding of the violence that permeated women's lives in Viking society. A traveling merchant brought word of a blood feud that had escalated beyond the usual boundaries of male combat, drawing women and children into a cycle of revenge that had already claimed a dozen lives. The story he told revealed the systematic ways in which women were both protected by and victimized by the culture of violence that defined Viking civilization. The feud had begun with a dispute over grazing rights between 2 prominent families, but it had quickly escalated when accusations of adultery were added to the mix. The woman at the center of the controversy, a young wife named Gudrun, had been accused of infidelity by her husband's brother, who claimed to have witnessed her in compromising circumstances with a neighboring farmer. The accusation was almost certainly false, motivated by the brother's desire to claim his siblings' property. But the damage was done. In Viking society, a woman's reputation was her most valuable asset, and once it was destroyed, there was no way to restore it. The legal proceedings that followed revealed the impossible position that women occupied in Viking justice. Gudrun was not allowed to defend herself directly. She had to rely on male relatives to speak for her, and their willingness to do so depended on their own assessment of the political and economic costs of supporting her. The evidence against her was circumstantial at best, but the burden of proof was effectively on her to demonstrate her innocence, a task that was virtually impossible given the restrictions on women's participation in legal proceedings. The violence that erupted when Gudrun's family refused to accept the adultery charges was swift and brutal. The initial confrontation left 3 men dead, but the real horror began when the conflict expanded to include attacks on women and children. Viking law theoretically protected non-combatants, but the reality was that women were often seen as legitimate targets for revenge, particularly when the original dispute involved questions of sexual propriety. The attacks were designed not just to cause physical harm, but to destroy the social fabric that held families together. Astrid listened to these accounts with growing horror as she realized how easily such violence could reach her own family. The merchant's descriptions of women being dragged from their homes, of children being orphaned in the space of a single night, of entire households being destroyed by the pursuit of revenge. These were not abstract tales from a distant land, but realistic possibilities that could manifest in her own settlement at any time. The protection offered by her husband's wealth and status was real but limited, and it could evaporate in the face of the right kind of accusation or political miscalculation. The psychological impact of living under the constant threat of violence was profound and lasting. Women learned to modulate their behavior, to avoid any action that might be misinterpreted, to maintain an impossible standard of propriety that left no room for normal human interaction. The fear was not just of physical harm, but of the social destruction that could follow from even the suspicion of impropriety. A woman who was accused of adultery, whether truthfully or falsely, faced not just the possibility of death but the certainty of social exile, economic ruin, and the loss of her children. The resolution of the Eastern feud, when it finally came, was typical of Viking justice. The surviving members of both families were forced to pay substantial compensation to neutral parties who had been drawn into the conflict, but the women who had been the original victims received nothing. Gudrun herself had disappeared during the height of the violence, and her fate remained unknown. The merchant who brought the news suggested that she had probably been killed, but others whispered that she had fled to a distant settlement where she might be able to start a new life under a different name. The uncertainty itself was a form of torture for women who understood that they could face similar accusations at any time, and that their survival would depend on factors entirely beyond their control. The summer trading season of 851 brought to Birka a sight that would forever change Astrid's understanding of the depths of cruelty that Viking society could inflict upon women. A group of raiders had returned from a successful expedition to the British Isles, bringing with them not just gold and silver, but also a cargo of human beings destined for slavery. Among the captives were 37 women and children, their faces bearing the hollow expression of people who had lost everything they had ever known and were now facing a future of unimaginable horror. The slave market was held in the central square of the settlement, a location chosen for its practical advantages: easy access for buyers and sellers, adequate space for displaying the merchandise, and proximity to the harbor where ships could be loaded for transport to other markets. The casual brutality of the proceedings was shocking even by Viking standards. The captives were stripped, examined like livestock, and subjected to degrading tests designed to assess their physical condition, their potential productivity, and their likely lifespan under harsh working conditions. The women in the group faced particular horrors that male slaves were spared. Their bodies were examined with clinical detachment by potential buyers, who were assessing not just their capacity for physical labor, but also their suitability for sexual exploitation. Young women were subjected to intimate examinations designed to determine their virginity, their fertility, and their potential value as concubines or breeding stock. The psychological trauma of these examinations was evident in the blank stares and trembling hands of the victims, who had been reduced to objects whose only value lay in their utility to their captors. The economic dynamics of the slave trade revealed the systematic nature of the exploitation that women faced in Viking society. Female slaves were typically priced higher than males because of their dual utility. They could perform household labor while also serving the sexual needs of their owners. This economic calculation meant that women were often separated from their families, sold to buyers who lived hundreds of miles apart, with no possibility of ever seeing their loved ones again. The deliberate destruction of family bonds was not an unfortunate side effect of the slave trade, but a calculated strategy designed to prevent resistance and ensure compliance. The legal status of female slaves was even more precarious than that of free women. They had no rights whatsoever, No legal recourse against abuse, and no hope of protection from even the most extreme forms of violence. A master could beat, rape, or kill a female slave with complete impunity, and the legal system offered no remedies for such treatment. The children born to female slaves automatically became the property of their mother's owners, creating a perpetual cycle of bondage that could last for generations. The psychological impact of witnessing the slave auction was profound for the free women of the settlement. They were forced to confront the reality that their own privileged position was based on the suffering of others, and that their freedom was conditional on their ability to maintain their position within the social hierarchy. The knowledge that they themselves could potentially face enslavement if their family's fortunes changed created a constant undercurrent of anxiety that affected every aspect of their lives. The aftermath of the slave auction revealed the ways in which the institution of slavery corrupted the entire community. The newly purchased slaves were distributed among the wealthiest families, where they were immediately put to work in the most demanding and dangerous tasks. The female slaves were housed in the darkest corners of the longhouses, where they were vulnerable to abuse from both their owners and other household members. The normalization of this treatment gradually eroded the moral boundaries that might have restrained the worst impulses of the free population. Astrid watched these proceedings with a mixture of horror and recognition. The treatment of the female slaves was an extreme version of the powerlessness that all women experienced in Viking society. The difference was one of degree rather than kind, and she began to understand that the social order she had always accepted as natural was actually built on a foundation of systematic oppression that could be extended or contracted depending on the political and economic needs of the moment. The slave market was not an aberration, but a logical extension of a society that viewed women primarily as property to be owned, traded, and exploited. The autumn of 852 brought with it a discovery that would reveal one of the most closely guarded secrets of Viking society: the complex and dangerous world of cedar magic, practiced almost exclusively by women who had found ways to carve out spaces of power within a system designed to exclude them. The revelation came through Astrid's growing friendship with Ragnhild, the settlement's healer, who had finally decided to share knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women in carefully guarded whispers. The practice of cedar was both revered and feared in Viking culture, representing a form of power that existed outside the normal channels of male authority. Women who practiced cedar were believed to possess the ability to see into the future, to communicate with the dead, and to influence events through supernatural means. This power made them valuable to chieftains and wealthy landowners who sought their counsel. But it also made them dangerous to the established order, which depended on the subordination of women to function properly. Ragnhild's initiation into the mysteries of cedar had begun during her youth, when she displayed an unusual sensitivity to the spiritual forces that Vikings believed permeated the natural world. Her training had been conducted in secret, away from the prying eyes of men who might have felt threatened by her growing knowledge. The education she received was comprehensive, covering not just the magical practices themselves, but also the political and social skills necessary to survive as a woman wielding power in a hostile environment. The tools of cedar practice were deceptively simple: a staff carved with runic symbols, a collection of herbs and stones gathered under specific conditions, and a deep knowledge of the songs and chants that were believed to bridge the gap between the physical and spiritual worlds. But the real power of cedar lay not in these material objects, but in the psychological manipulation and social intelligence that practitioners developed through years of careful observation and practice. A skilled cedar woman could read the subtle cues that revealed people's fears, desires, and intentions, and she could use this knowledge to influence their behavior in ways that seemed magical to outside observers. The political implications of cedar practice were profound and far-reaching. Women who possessed these skills could accumulate wealth, influence, and protection that were normally reserved for men. They could broker marriages, settle disputes, and even influence the outcome of military campaigns through their supposed ability to predict the future. But this power came at a terrible cost. Practitioners were constantly vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft, and they lived under the constant threat of violence from those who feared their abilities. The sexual dynamics surrounding Seder practice revealed another layer of the complex relationship between women and power in Viking society. Male practitioners of Seder were viewed with suspicion and contempt, branded as effeminate and unnatural. But female practitioners were seen as both alluring and dangerous, their magical abilities intertwined with their sexuality in ways that made them objects of both desire and fear. This association with sexuality made Seder women particularly vulnerable to accusations of using their powers for malicious purposes, especially when political or economic disputes arose. The training that Ragnhild offered to share with Astrid was not just about learning magical techniques, but about understanding the complex web of relationships and obligations that governed the hidden world of women's power. The knowledge came with risks. Practitioners could be accused of causing crop failures, livestock deaths, or human illnesses, and the penalties for such accusations were severe. But it also offered the possibility of independence and influence that were otherwise unavailable to women in Viking society. The revelation of the Seder tradition forced Astrid to reconsider everything she thought she knew about the position of women in her society. The existence of this hidden network of female practitioners suggested that women had been finding ways to resist and subvert male authority for generations, using spiritual beliefs and magical practices as tools of empowerment and survival. The brutal reality was that even these forms of resistance were precarious and dangerous, dependent on the tolerance of men who could withdraw their protection at any moment. But the very existence of Seder practice proved that women were not passive victims of their circumstances. They were active agents who had found ways to create spaces of power within a system designed to exclude them. The winter of 853 brought with it a series of events that would demonstrate the quiet but persistent ways in which women had been reshaping Viking society from within, using their traditional roles as cover for a gradual transformation of the social order. The catalyst was a dispute over inheritance that had arisen when Jarl Magnus died without male heirs, leaving his substantial holdings to be contested by distant male relatives who had shown no interest in the family's welfare during his lifetime. The deceased Jarl's widow, Astrid's own Aunt Thera, had managed the estate with remarkable skill during her husband's long illness, demonstrating a level of administrative competence that surpassed most of the men in the settlement. Under her management, the estate had actually increased in value, the livestock had multiplied, and the agricultural yields had improved significantly. Yet according to traditional inheritance law, she had no legal claim to the property she had effectively been managing for years. The legal proceedings that followed revealed the complex ways in which women had been quietly subverting the system through careful planning and strategic alliances. Thera had spent years cultivating relationships with key figures in the community, providing them with valuable services and information while carefully documenting her contributions to the estate's prosperity. She had also been training her daughters in the skills necessary to manage complex enterprises, preparing them for a future where they might need to protect their own interests against male relatives who viewed them as obstacles to their own advancement. The network of women who rallied to support Thera's case was extensive and sophisticated, revealing a level of organization and communication that had been invisible to the men who nominally controlled the settlement. These women had been sharing information, coordinating strategies, and providing mutual support for generations, creating a parallel power structure that operated alongside but separate from the official hierarchy. Their influence was exercised through the management of households, the arrangement of marriages, and the careful cultivation of relationships with key decision-makers. The economic argument that Thera's supporters presented was compelling and difficult to dismiss. They demonstrated that the estate's prosperity was directly linked to her management skills, and that transferring control to her late husband's male cousins would likely result in its decline. They also pointed out that the traditional inheritance system was economically inefficient, wasting the talents and experience of women who had proven their capabilities through years of practical application. The argument was not based on abstract principles of justice, but on concrete evidence of economic performance. The social pressure campaign that accompanied the legal proceedings was subtle but effective. The women of the settlement began to withdraw their cooperation from the male relatives who were contesting the inheritance, making it clear that their claim would be met with passive resistance that could make life very difficult for them. The campaign was carefully orchestrated to avoid direct confrontation, while making it clear that accepting Thyra's claim would be the path of least resistance. The resolution of the dispute was a compromise that reflected the changing dynamics of power in Viking society. Thyra was granted formal recognition as the estate's manager, with the understanding that ownership would pass to her daughters rather than to her late husband's male relatives. The arrangement was presented as a temporary expedient, but everyone involved understood that it represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power between men and women. The broader implications of this quiet revolution were profound. Women throughout the settlement began to recognize that change was possible, that the system that had oppressed them for generations was not as immutable as they had been taught to believe. The success of Thyra's case encouraged other women to challenge unfair arrangements, to assert their rights more boldly, and to work together to create new forms of social organization that better reflected their actual contributions to the community's prosperity. The spring of 854 marked the 10th anniversary of Astrid's marriage, a milestone that prompted deep reflection on the journey that had brought her from a frightened 15-year-old girl to a woman who had learned to navigate the complex and often brutal realities of Viking society. The decade had been marked by loss, growth, and the gradual recognition that the position of women in her world was neither fixed nor hopeless, but was instead subject to change through careful effort and strategic thinking. The settlement itself had been transformed by the quiet revolution that had begun with her Aunt Thyra's successful challenge to traditional inheritance law. Other women had followed her example, asserting their rights to property, demanding fair treatment in legal disputes, and gradually reshaping the social order through persistent effort and mutual support. The changes were subtle but significant, creating new opportunities for women while also generating new forms of resistance from men who felt threatened by the erosion of their traditional authority. Astrid's own household had become a center of this transformation. Her management of Olaf's estate had proven so effective that he had gradually ceded more and more authority to her, recognizing that his economic interests were best served by allowing her to exercise her considerable talents. The arrangement was mutually beneficial. She gained practical independence while he benefited from her skills and could take credit for the estate's prosperity. The compromise was not perfect, but it represented a significant improvement over the complete subordination that had characterized the early years of their marriage. The network of women that had formed around the settlement's transformation included members from all levels of society, from the wives of wealthy landowners to the thralls who labored in the fields. The organization was informal but effective, providing mutual support, sharing information, and coordinating strategies for challenging unfair treatment. The group had developed its own forms of communication, its own methods of decision-making, and its own ways of supporting members who faced retaliation for their efforts to improve their situation. The education of the next generation had become a particular focus of the women's efforts. They had begun to teach their daughters not just the traditional skills of household management, but also the political and economic knowledge necessary to protect their interests in a hostile world. The education was conducted carefully, disguised as normal domestic instruction, but it was comprehensive and sophisticated, covering everything from legal procedures to negotiation strategies to the management of complex business enterprises. The resistance to these changes had been significant, but not overwhelming. Some men had attempted to reassert traditional authority through violence or legal challenges, but they had found themselves isolated and opposed by a community that had come to recognize the value of women's contributions. The economic prosperity that had resulted from allowing women to exercise their talents had created powerful incentives for maintaining the new arrangements, even among men who were philosophically opposed to the changes. The spiritual dimension of the transformation had been particularly significant. The practice of Seder had evolved from a secretive and dangerous activity to a more open form of religious expression that provided women with legitimate sources of authority and influence. The broader implications of the changes extended far beyond the settlement itself. Word of the women's success had spread to other communities, inspiring similar movements and creating a network of communication and support that spanned the entire region. As Astrid reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point, She recognized that the brutal realities of women's lives in Viking society had not been eliminated, but had been significantly mitigated. The changes had created new opportunities, new forms of protection, and new sources of hope for women who had previously faced lives of complete subordination. The transformation was incomplete and fragile, dependent on continued effort and vigilance, but it represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power that had seemed impossible when she first arrived at Olaf's farmstead as a terrified bride. The future remained uncertain, but it was no longer hopeless. The women of the settlement had demonstrated that change was possible, that the system that had oppressed them for generations could be modified through careful effort and strategic thinking. The brutal truth about women's lives in Viking society was that they had always been more powerful than they appeared, more resourceful than they were given credit for, and more capable of creating change than their oppressors had ever imagined. Thank you for joining me on this cozy corner of history. If you enjoyed our time together tonight, I'd love it if you'd subscribe and share these stories with a friend. There are so many more fascinating tales to explore together. But for now, I'll bid you a fond good night. Stay warm, stay safe, and I'll see you next time for another journey into the past. Sweet dreams.